Let's go for it. It's not as nice as doing that filming in the Sanger at all. So I sent through some really brief topic guide, which is what we did with the other people we filmed. But it was really just a conversation about development genetic counselling. So
let's have that conversation.
What was it like for you?
What was it like for me? Okay. So when I joined the profession so I finished my master's in 1995, and I was sponsored to do the master's through St James's Hospital in Leeds. And as was the way things worked in the day, you would walk into a job straight away. So there was no sort of practice run of being a genetic counsellor. My first job was as a general genetic counsellor and working specifically with deafness, and then doing a research project on deafness. But in those days, what was it like then? Well, it was certainly in Leeds, genetic counselling work was very psychosocial. Every consultation had a pre-clinic home visit, and so my experience right at the beginning was going off, travelling all the way around Yorkshire to do home visits. And I remember going off to the Yorkshire moors and meeting with farming families, and going off to the coast to Scarborough. I remember meeting families with DMD and taking blood, and had my little phlebotomy kit that I would take in the car. And and I remember at the time referrals that came into the department that said anything about this patient is struggling, or they're finding this difficult. These were sort of code words that went straight into the genetic counsellor's inbox. So any way of getting up the waiting list to see a genetic counsellor was these sorts of code words that we'd look for in the clinic, in the referral letters. So psychosocial was the big focus of the work then. And we had Christina Oliver was our counselling supervisor, who was a psychotherapist. And we'd have very frequent counselling supervision to talk about the impact of what we were seeing and hearing. And
had you had any formal training outside of your master's course? I mean, how much counselling training did you get in your master's course?
There was quite a lot of detached training around psychotherapy, but from other disciplines, so not necessarily specifically genetic counselling. So I remember we had lectures from a palliative care clinician about breaking bad news and grief cycles, and Rogerian counselling. But walking into a department as in Leeds that had a very, very focused psychosocial model, that was completely new for me. So I think I did a lot of my learning about counselling there. And then I did do Heather Skirton's certificate in counselling skills later, which was also very helpful. But it was very much learning on the job, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds as if, Christine at Leeds she wasn't so well, she was well known in the general genetic counselling community, but she wasn't so influential. But it sounds as if she was incredibly influential in your development as a genetic counsellor.
Yeah, and for all of us in Leeds, very influential. Yeah, really got us to challenge everything that we did around reflective models. So the development of the internal supervisor in one's head that gives you a running commentary on everything you do, I would fully credit that to Christina and her influence.
That
set me off, I think, or set me up in terms of that feeling a very valuable part of what the profession should be. And it was, that's how it was for me.
So it gave you the framework for what you thought genetic counselling should aspire to.
I guess so. I mean, in Leeds at the time, we were very much not the servants of the clinical geneticists. I wouldn't say that, but we were very much in the support role. So the role was about providing the information for the clinic, and the clinic was what the doctors did. And so there was this sort of tension about, well, what are our actual skills or our autonomous skills? So, but bear in mind, this is the mid-90s, so
yes,
autonomous practice wasn't really, I don't know, wasn't consistent,
wasn't prevalent. What can you remember talking with? What was available for families at that time that you saw, and was it predominantly rare disease families?
Yes, so it was, yes, predominantly rare disease families, and well, because I was in Leeds and Bradford, the transcultural genetic counselling service was a very active part of what we all did and all contributed to. So working alongside Mushtaq Ahmed and Gulshan Kabani and Sagira Malik, and experiencing, genetic counselling in Punjabi and in Urdu and the different languages and the transcultural exchange. We had many discussions about cultural matching, whether it's more helpful to culturally match or not culturally match. Because when you don't culturally match between counsellor and patient, you do get an opportunity to challenge cultural beliefs, and also offer alternatives. Christina was so pivotal in helping us to think through those kinds of counselling dynamics. And then for me, I was also working in the deaf community then as well. So we had loads of conversations about cultural matching between a deaf genetic counsellor, deaf sign language user, and a patient's needs. Matching there.
Really, you've a really different experience actually from other people I've spoken to. Really different. Shows the influence of. I've always recognised the influence of the centres where we work on what we think we do, we should do. But Leeds was an outlier in that sense, in that very counselling model wasn't out there at the time. Really interesting. So in terms of the development of the profession, what's your recollection of who was important, or how it was happening?
I had so my own experience was I was doing a degree in genetics at Newcastle University and doing lots of molecular work there, and knew very early on that I did not want to work in a laboratory. And I remember in Newcastle, I don't know whether I'd seen John Byrne present or heard of him, but certainly as a very charismatic leader, I was drawn to the clinical focus of genetics. Judith Goodship was quite prominent as well in Newcastle, and I remember going to see her and saying, well, what can I do with my degree in genetics? She's the one that recommended that I look up Manchester, because it was that point the master's in Manchester was only in its first year. So I applied to do the master's programme in Manchester, and got into the second year. And I remember at the time there were 2,000 applicants for one place, and we had 4 places, I think. So that it was really, really tricky to get in, and really highly sought after. And it was a bit overwhelming, actually. I hadn't quite anticipated it would be such an interesting sport. So in terms of influences around that, then Lauren Kurtzen-Storer, was such a huge mentor in terms of helping us collectively from the course to recognise our clinical skills and counselling skills, and the absence of the nursing skills that we didn't have, because the context within genetic counselling in the UK at the time was very nursing dominated, quite understandably. So Lauren was very nurturing in helping us to accept that, yes, whilst we weren't nurses, we had other things that we could contribute. And I do remember some of the first AGNC conferences that I went to, being sort of, one of 5 masters trained genetic counsellors amongst a sea of nurses in what was then Ganaswa and then became AJNC, and feeling in the minority and feeling, oh, have we got the right skills, and feeling very young, and feeling very different, you know.
Right.
And I remember when I was looking for my sponsorship for the course, I went to various different genetics departments up and down the UK saying, there's this new course, would you sponsor me to go on it? And I remember going to Nottingham and being told, well, you're not a nurse, so therefore you don't know anything about cystic fibrosis medicines, so therefore you won't be a good genetic nurse counsellor. And I remember thinking, do I need to know about cystic fibrosis medicines? Oh no.
Because you can look them up if you need to know.
Well, yeah, but also we weren't trained to do that. It's like, oh no, how on earth will we survive if we don't know about prescribing? And that really stayed with me, because I've continually questioned, do we ever actually need to know? Well, we don't really. But anyway, at the time, that was a very prominent thing. If you didn't come from that nursing background, then you wouldn't be right. And also I sensed at the time, you know, there was some very prominent genetic counsellors, genetic nurses. I remember Chris Barnes, I remember Penny Gilbert, I remember Heather Skirton, and, you know, going to conferences and they would be presenting or chairing, and feeling a sense of, well, this is amazing, joining this incredible profession, but still yet to find out one's place in it.
Yes.
How it was in the early days.
Yes. Yeah. I suppose in a way, well, we're in another transition phase at the moment, but we won't talk about that so much at the moment. But yeah, where people are questioning which tribe they belong to, and there's becoming a creation of tribes, it seems to me, that the fundamental thing that the group of us tried to do was to say, basically, there's this job that needs to be done, and there's these skills that you need to do it, and we need to equip people with those skills and competencies, but it doesn't prioritize one existing health profession over another existing health profession over no health profession. We really did not want to split the masters prepared genetic counsellors and the genetic nurses. We're too small numbers for
there was definitely
but
there was definitely that sense, and I think, I mean, quite rightly, it took a little while for the masters trained genetic counsellors to prove their value and their worth. And, you know, that did take a little bit of time. I mean, it's just being at the beginning of that, I just remember feeling a little bit frightened and a little bit unsure. But also, we, you know, internationally, we had the models of genetic counselling practice from the US and Canada and Australia and South Africa. So, I mean, looking to them, and, you know, if we were lucky enough, and I was, because I was always research focused, I would go to the NSGC conference or the Human Genetic Society of Australasia conferences, and see how genetic counsellors there were working, and, you know, and you felt this sense of, well, we're an international profession, and, you know, it was also very reassuring to see that what we did in the UK was keep everybody together, whereas what happened in the US was this split, wasn't there, the nurses and the genetic counsellors, and that never felt very helpful. It was always very reassuring that we didn't do that in the UK.
Yes. When did you sort of become aware that there was this push to professional registration, or was that always there in the world you entered into from the beginning?
I'm laughing because I remember it very, very clearly. So I remember when the AGNC at the time did their road shows and came round to the different departments and talk about registration. I can't remember who it was who came to see us in Leeds, but we were quite a big team. So we had about, I don't know, maybe 15, 16, 17 genetic counsellors. We were quite big. There's a lot of us, because we had a couple of social workers, and there was the genetic nurses, and then there was myself, a genetic counsellor, and the transcultural team. So it was quite a mixture of different people. And I remember this, I didn't even really know what the AGNC was then, but came to talk to us about, about professional registration. We hadn't a clue what was going on. I mean,
okay.
hadn't a clue. And there was all this sort of mutterings about, why do we need to do this? This is all a load of nonsense. This sounds like an awful lot of work. And I remember thinking, no, this is about keeping us together, and we have to demonstrate our skills, and this is a real opportunity. Actually, thinking about it, that was probably quite influential in my decision making to join the GCRB. So I joined the GCRB in 2004.
Oh, really? I didn't realise that.
2004, yeah. Well, then it was called the AGNC board.
Oh, right. So it wouldn't have been the GCRB. It would have been.
No, it was the registration board.
Registered board. Okay.
Yeah, but it was, at the time, it was called the AGNC registration board.
Okay.
And then it turned into the GCRB.
Yeah.
And so that was I got my registration in 2003. And
so you must have been one of the very early ones.
I was the second cohort. Yeah. Yes, I remember. So it was Sally Watts who was my, I think we called
assessor or something.
I think we called them examiners then, but yeah, it was technically assessor. And she wrote a very nice report about my work.
Okay. Yeah, because I was out of genetics during that time. So I was in the early bit, and then I was off doing my PhDs and postdocs. And then when I left academia at that time and then came back into the NHS in 2006, I had to register. I wasn't registered.
You hadn't, even though you'd helped set it all up.
Yeah, I hadn't registered because I wasn't in clinical practice.
Do you remember who assessed your work?
No, my mentor was Heather, and she was very unkind. I did all my case studies, and she just sent them back to me saying, these are not case studies, they're academic pieces of writing, do them again. Attending to the psychosocial implications.
Oh, how fantastic. And you were doing a PhD, so you knew how to actually write.
Yes. Yeah, that was funny. Yes. So I wasn't part of the roadshow. I can remember the roadshows being planned, but I wasn't part of them. Yeah.
I mean, it was so needed. I think the regional clinical genetics services around the UK that were actually disconnected from a sense of unity in the profession, and maybe Leeds possibly was then. I wouldn't say it is now, but we needed that kind of rallying call to let's join together. But it caused a lot of mutterings and confusion, and a sense of, well, why do I need to prove my benefit? All this kind of stuff.
And I maintain my nurse's registration, and that cost me X number of pounds a year, which I have to pay for something else. Yeah. And will I lose my NHS pension was a big, special class status. You're probably not aware of this. If you were a member of the NHS pension for long enough, continuously, you could retire at 55 on a full pension.
Oh, well, I did have that. So I had that in my clause. I very stupidly transferred my NHS pension that had that clause in it to my university pension, which was a really stupid idea because I lost that right.
Anyway, that's a separate discussion. I was forced to, because you could, in King's, you could only keep your NHS pension if you were employed by the Faculty of Medicine.
Oh.
They claimed that was on the orders of the Secretary of State for Health, but that's a separate grievance.
Makes no sense whatsoever.
Makes no sense at all.
Probably not true.
Yes. Yeah. So what do you sort of remember next were the stepping stones in the professional registration journey?
Well, so when I joined the GCRB 2004, there were definitely conversations at that time about statutory regulation, and there were big discussions which still continue today around specialist registration versus general registration. And I remember then looking again internationally to see what was happening around the world, and particularly talking with Clara Gaff and the Australian Board of Genetic Counsellors about their specialist registration program, which hadn't worked so well, and they had stopped it and gone back to general registration for all genetic counsellors. I was also very aware of what was going on in terms of licensure in the US, and the competency to practice that had a legal framework around it.
Yes.
And also in South Africa as well, membership of the Health Professions Council, I think they call it there in South Africa, and getting that as soon as you got your master's qualification, you just automatically got your registration to practice. So there was lots of different models. And so when I was on the board, my keen interest was bringing the international kind of flavour and reciprocity. Yeah, so I was part of the group that wrote the original reciprocity registration guidelines for the board, which have now changed because there wasn't much reciprocity. You know, we were very open. You know, we were saying, come to the UK if you're registered or certified in the US or Australia or South Africa, wherever. Come and we will recognise your qualifications. And that was only reciprocated in Australia and South Africa. The America didn't reciprocate it. So, you know, many conversations and battles over the years about that. But part of that kind of thinking then was, as a board, you know, we were very much thinking about the statutory regulation requirement. So I was sort of in and out of the discussions with HP's Healthcare Professions Council, as it's now become, in and out of those discussions. I did go to a few of the big meetings. I remember a big, I can't even remember where it was, somewhere in London, and we all had a big photograph taken outside.
We did. We had that photograph.
Yes. And I was like, hooray, we've got through. And I was like, oh, no, we haven't.
No, we haven't.
Yeah. And then I stepped off the board soon after that. So then I wasn't part of any of those discussions moving forward, but very supportive from the sidelines.
Yeah, from the sidelines, what was your perception of it? That it was just sort of not strolling along is the wrong word, but it was chugging along.
My perception of it was that people like Georgie Hall were carrying an enormous heaviness around it, and doing absolutely sterling pioneering work and keeping all of that going. And I don't know, what was my perception? I mean, it wasn't the profession that was struggling, it was the infrastructure around the regulatory processes that seemed to change every 5 minutes. So from that end, it was chaotic, really chaotic, and very unfair. And you know, the change of government was a big deal for many people, for the registration process, but also personally for me. Changing government actually changed my job, which so I had actually applied for an NIHR fellowship to do a piece of work, which I got. So really hard to get these fellowships. And we had the change in government, and then all the funding went overnight. So I got a fellowship.
I didn't realise that.
Yeah, right. Got a really prestigious fellowship, and then it just went. And it was on genetic counselling, and it was on access, diversity, inclusion issues in terms of access to services. And there was all this kind of government rhetoric around the importance of genetics, our inheritance, our future, all those white papers that were coming out. But yet the support for the profession on the ground was just very sketchy. And it took a lot of real pioneering people, yourself included, to get that recognition that we needed training centres, you know, and that we needed the formalisation of the processes around what genetic counselling was. We needed outcome measures. I'm thinking about Marion McAllister's work, genetic counselling outcome scales, how, you know, how much we desperately needed that kind of evidence base behind what we did. And she was amazing in pioneering in psychometric testing, and pushing all of that forward. Because there was all this, internationally, there was all this discussion, wasn't there, with psychologists and external ethicists and external social scientists who were writing and talking about the impact of genetics on patients. I'm thinking about Teresa Marteau as well. But yet they weren't inside working with patients.
No, and they were and great pioneering work, and we've all learned from it, but they were using the use case of genetics to support their theoretical frameworks. So they'd have a psychology theoretical framework, or a particular way they viewed social structures, or etc. And then they used genetics as the use case rather than feeding back into what's the value of this to the individual. And particularly, I think, this is my personal feeling, in the UK, where we have a health service where you've always got competition for resources. So you have to demonstrate value in relation to the health service as a whole.
And also, I think if you've not had personal experience of sitting in a clinical setting, I mean, even as a researcher, sitting in a clinical setting, but there's something about having that clinical experience, that reality check is really needed, I think, in a lot of that early sort of 1990s onwards psychosocial research about what genetic counselling is and should be. It was quite detached from the reality of what it actually was. And that really gave me a personal push to forge an academic career, was feeling that there were amazing researchers and academics researching us, but yet we could offer a different lens that was equally of value. From the inside.
Which was about researching the doing of it. Rather than the act of it.
And so Marion's work was so pivotal because it was so grounded in, the first phases of it were all the interviews and focus groups with patients through the eyes and the lens of a genetic counsellor who really knows what happens within consultations. So valuable that work.
And then also building onto it and bringing it into the health economics world and the sort of NHS management world. And I can remember we were piloting the outcome scale at Guy's, or in London, and one centre said they couldn't use it because it was about genetic counselling, so it was irrelevant to the majority of the clinical practice in their centre. It wasn't the genetic counsellors that necessarily said that, because it was about genetic counselling. It wasn't. They wanted a satisfaction survey to
not realising that that's all empowerment is, very closely a proxy for satisfaction. Whatever. I mean, that's so interesting because my observations. I've worked in Leeds, Cambridge, and Cardiff clinical genetic services. Various different kinds of roles. My observation in all of those was that the majority of the work was actually done by the genetic counsellors. Physical number of patients getting departments. The genetic counsellors did the majority of the work. So interesting.
It's interesting. Anyway, that's it. But I think it was about they didn't want their clinical interactions assessed by this outcome scale.
Well, that then brings us on to what are the differences between what clinical geneticists do and what genetic counsellors do. So if clinical geneticists are not doing genetic counselling, and I think many would argue that they are actually, but say if they're not doing genetic counselling, what are they doing? Is it just diagnostics? Is it just pattern recognition in terms of phenotyping? The sort of care of the individual and the family and the onward testing and the ethical issues, is that only the domain of the genetic counsellors? If so, let's have that in our core competencies.
But I think we can only even consider that as a possibility because we already had a developed competency framework supported by registration. It's not perfect and it will need reviewing and working on.
Yeah.
If we hadn't had that already in place, we possibly would have been in a very different situation now. Well, I think we'd have had genetic counselling being part of the clinical scientists. In a sense it is, but because we'd already done the development work, we were able to shape it as part of the clinical scientist training program. I think it would have just been a module. It possibly would have been just a module on talking nicely to people.
Yeah.
The lab result.
I feel as if I've spent a whole career trying to define and also measure and evaluate to some degree what it is what is the art of what genetic counselling is. What is it? What is that magic in terms of the dynamic and the exchange that patients value so much, and articulating that is actually really hard, and it shouldn't be.
No, it is really hard because I think, anyway, this is a sort of outside, well, no, it is relevant to the future of genetic counselling. I think we're in such a transition period at the moment, driven partly by the technology, but also just, we're 40 years on from the 1980s. It's just partly we're in a different world. We're in a world of big data, we're in a world of tech. We're in a world perhaps of different expectations of healthcare. And all of that, we're in this constant state of change and flux, but I guess perhaps we always have been.
I think we always have been. I think we always have been. I mean, I hear talking to genetic counsellors now in clinical practice that they have never been so busy and that they've never been so stretched and it's never been so stressful. But it's always been that rhetoric.
Yes.
I think people forget it was always like that. Everything was moving so fast.
Yeah.
I remember when the HD gene was discovered and brought into clinical practice, and there was just this flurry of, let's create protocols around how we do it. We have to have 2 consultations before we're allowed to take blood for testing because it's all, it's all high pressure. This is all going to be very upsetting for patients. Let's, figure out how we're going to do this. And then, the next thing is, well, we've got prenatal testing and termination of pregnancy. What should we be offering it for? What conditions is it acceptable for? Who makes the decisions about it? And then, of course, it's NIPT now. It's just every 5 years there's another shift in the technology and what we can actually do. But some of the basic principles have always remained the same in terms of autonomy and protecting space to make decisions that are patient-based.
And having regard for individuals' own strengths, really, I think. I suppose one of the things that, we did some really basic sort of evaluation work or exploration of people who'd had repeated different technologies came along. So you retest the family and you modify the carrier status. I don't think it was ever even published, but it was a sort of, let's go back and ask these people how it was. And the big, and it, but the big message from me from that work actually was that genetics interaction was vitally important at the moment it was needed. Totally irrelevant to the great majority of people's lives. So we had to invest, my model would be we invest care absolutely properly, quickly, efficiently when it's needed, but then we don't overinflate our involvement in the rest of people's lives because people will just get on with their lives.
You see, I have a slightly different view. I think you're absolutely right in that we do have a certain arrogance about the meaning and impact that we have. But I do think for some patients, when there are inherited conditions that are running through families, there is certainly a heaviness because of the inheritance of it. So there's always
I agree.
But it wouldn't necessarily take them back to the genetic counselling consultation, but the condition itself leads to a heaviness.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And anyway, I think from those early days when we did home visits, and we did fairly, we were there on the end of a phone to people. We lost that. And I'd like to see that care, long-term care, come back somehow.
Well, I remember when there was a shift to telephone consultations and everybody was up in arms that you lose the eye contact and you lose the dynamic. And then, of course, we're now having the same conversations about the shift from telephone to virtual online consultations. And what do you lose? And we can't wait to get back to the clinic consultation. And then, but yeah, we're not doing home visits anymore. There was, I remember when the home visits were lost. There's this whole thing about, well, you're not seeing people in their own family context and in their own, and that's true. But neither was anybody else in medicine, really, unless you're a health visitor and you had that luxury of going to see somebody in their home.
Going back to your theme of evaluation and research, we have no gold standard for any of this.
No.
We have custom and practice and what we believe.
Yeah.
We still haven't created a gold, we probably never will, but the evidence is still not there. Yeah,
absolutely. And what is it that actually genuinely works for people and what doesn't? And I remember genetic counsellors arguing for the pre-clinic home visit. Like I, for example, might do like one home visit a day because it would take me 2.5 hours to get to a patient and then come back again and I'd be exhausted. How inefficient is that? But yet we were all hanging on to it. And NHS managers were saying, well, why aren't you seeing 20 patients in a day? Well, because it's very deep and meaningful.
Yes. We got away with it for quite a while.
I tell you who was a very influential person, I think, in terms of the profession, in terms of knowledge, skills, frameworks, was Jill Scott, counsellor from Scotland, and she moved around various different departments. So she was also in Newcastle, I think, as well. In that, when we were going through Agenda for Change, where as a profession we had to benchmark ourselves against catering staff in the NHS, physiotherapists and nurses. And we needed to really get our act together very, very quickly as a profession to identify where our knowledge, skills and framework sat compared to other NHS professionals. And Jill was absolutely pivotal in that piece of work. So she was on the GCRB then, in actually identifying, compared to other professions, what we actually did. And I'd say thanks to her, genetic counsellors came out very highly in the marking.
Yes.
So we had band 7 and 8 positions.
Yeah.
Compared to nurses that were running wards who were on 4s, 5s, and 6s.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I remember that. And I think, it was a sterling piece of work that group did and she did that has sort of disappeared from people's memory, or perhaps they never even knew it.
Yeah.
Because they were presented with, well, this is the banding on the Agenda for Change framework.
Yeah.
And this is, what's been agreed, and here's the job descriptions, and here's the knowledge and skills framework attached to those job descriptions. Yeah.
It was, and I remember Jill was doing an MBA, I think it was at the time.
Right.
That was really professionalizing.
Yes.
What the board was doing at the time, which was really helpful. I mean,
yes.
So much of the development of our profession has been, well, my observation, it's been willing people who've been giving it a good go, but not necessarily had the skills in, I don't know, health economics or in leadership or in operations, to actually deliver. But it was, everybody was just pulling together and having a go at trying to professionalize everything, weren't they?
Yeah. I'm conscious of time, Anna, but are there other important things that are important to you that you want to bring, or anything else that you want to bring?
Well, I wanted to say how important I feel the academic part of the genetic counselling eclectic skills mix is, and I feel that we have a long way to go as a profession to recognise the skills that research genetic counsellors bring to the space. And you and I have been working in this space for a little while now, haven't we? And you know, it's long overdue that we have the funding support and the infrastructural support and the recognition of what we actually contribute. So I think we're seen as sort of outliers a little bit.
I think, with many of the allied health professionals, but I think you have been a great role model and leader in that, in a way you professionalized it, in the same way that you said, you know, Gillian brought her skills from her MBA to professionalize the work of the GCLB. You brought your skills and your academic leadership to professionalize the potential for academic development.
Honestly, I sit on the shoulders of giants, Chris. So like yourself and Heather, you know, I'm just thinking in terms of Heather. Gosh, when Heather got her professorship, oh my word. I remember actually I was on a board meeting with her, and Alistair Kent was on the board then, and he came in and he said, "Oh, Heather, I can call you Professor Heather Skirton now." And the board, we were just in such awe. You know, this is so exciting for our profession to have a professor. Academic recognition, so important to have that leadership, that role model.
And somebody who defines themselves as a genetic counsellor in a senior academic position. So isn't apologetic, you know, they're not saying, well, I've moved away from clinical practice now, or no, I'm not really a proper genetic counsellor. It's I'm a nurse, genetic counsellor, and a professor. I've really struggled with that myself, you know, in terms of would I still be accepted as a genetic counsellor if I'm focusing full-time in academia? And I've had my own battles with that. I wanted to be still seen as a genetic counsellor. Amongst clinical colleagues, I think there has been a certain sense of, well, you're only doing research, so therefore you don't know what's going on in the real world. And I would argue that when you're in academia, it opens doors for you that clinicians don't have access to, because suddenly you get into, well, conversations directly with NHS England, for example, with the board of the Sanger Institute or Wellcome or wherever, where there are very interesting high level ideas that can influence governments, you know, and it gives you a way in that you wouldn't if you were a genetic counsellor. Well, I mean, if you think of somebody like Sue Hill, she identifies as a clinical scientist. She's not, you know, and she's obviously the chief clinical scientist. She doesn't work, certainly doesn't work in a lab. You know?
No, so it's still okay.
Sign off lab reports.
Still okay to be, you know, retain that link to your original core, what guides you. But also, Chris, I was thinking when you were president of the European Society of Human Genetics, you know, having a genetic counsellor in such a leadership, pivotal position there, that the knock-on effect in terms of professionalisation of our profession was just profound. And same thing for having genetic counsellors, you know, chairing the BSGM or, you know, the big professional bodies. When genetic counsellors have those positions, it gives all the rest of us such a sense of unity and pride in what we're doing. It's so important.
I can remember saying to somebody that when you do these, when you get these positions or do these leadership positions, it's managing that balance between you're not there, essentially you're not there to represent genetic counsellors, but there's a huge sense of responsibility because people see you as a genetic counsellor, but you're there to do a job. You know, you're there to do a job, and if you really do it well, then that will reflect well on the profession. So that's a huge sense of responsibility. But what you're can't do is represent them and it's an odd thing. You can't sort of push their views and above everybody else, because you're there for the whole organisation, not only the genetic counsellor proportion of it. That's been quite difficult for some people to understand, I think. No,
I get you on that. We also have to keep stepping out of our UK or even England often been, hasn't it? But UK focused lens, because we are situated within an international field of genetic counselling. And we fought hard to keep our title, even though we were,
yes,
there was quite a lot of pressure, wasn't there, to lose the title of genetic counsellor and become well, what would it be? Genetic associate, genetic, whatever.
practitioner.
We never really came up with a good alternative, did we? But we wanted to keep ourselves linked to the profession of genetic counselling, because there's a whole history and body of literature, aligned competencies around the world. Even though we're only 300 in the UK at the moment, there's only 7,000 worldwide. We're still really small.
Yes.
Yeah, we're one of the professional groups that's so in demand, particularly at the moment, in terms of being invited to sit on, whether it's commercial direct to consumer testing company boards, or whether it's global research projects that involve patients, or whether it's clinical services, or whether it's learning from different models of genomic medicine in different places around the world. We're very in demand, aren't we? And it's wonderful.
Yeah, and patients want, they see genetic counsellors as doing something that, I'm just thinking of the public dialogue and whole genome sequencing a newborn. Those dialogue members, who are a wide variety of experiences and backgrounds and etc., saw genetic counsellors. They weren't quite sure what they wanted them to do, but they saw them as part of that pathway in the psychosocial support arena. I was so proud of that. I was so proud of what we had achieved, that we reached that profile.
Yeah. And in terms of moving forward and what the role will evolve into in the next 10 years, being guided by what patients think is the most important to them. You and I have written about the post-test care needs to not be forgotten. So much historically, so much of genetic counselling was on the pre-test care, wasn't it? Preparing people.
Yes.
Single gene results, and now it's you have a whole panel or a whole enormous plethora of analyses that you could have, and so it's the post-care consequences and what next feels like that's the direction, which comes back to the psychosocial
and the collaboration and the team working and the supporting other health professionals to deliver aspects of the care. Yeah.
So in terms of professional boundaries, I still don't completely feel that we've nailed it. But a recent report that I was involved in writing when I was chair of the AGNC, which I stepped down from in 2019, was around the role delineation of what genetic counsellors do that's different from what clinical geneticists do. And genetic counsellors have so many overlapping skills with clinical geneticists, but they also have lots of additional skills, which is about the care of the family and the longer term management of the psychosocial issues, referring on as appropriate, but when you see multiple generations of family, it's that continuity. And also dealing with all the ethical issues, and also dealing with the family communication issues and holding the family. That's so valuable as genomic medicine mainstreams, and keeping those skills and training others to use those skills as well.
So anything else you had on the front of your brain to
say? I mean, the other thing that's driven me personally is the inclusion and diversity angle of genetic counselling. I think because I came from the transcultural genetic counselling service in Leeds, and also did the original research on deaf adults' attitudes towards prenatal testing for deafness, with the option to select for a hearing pregnancy. That also guides a lot of my thinking, and I feel very proud of that research. That was my PhD research. That was in 1998. I published my first paper on that, and that sort of ethical conundrum of what is normal, what choices do we have in terms of ending a pregnancy, or it could be,
selecting
selecting for,
whatever.
selecting
Yes.
against, and which translates into PGD, NIPT, all the issues around normal and what's disability and things. That work came from the early 90s onwards, and it still feels very current today. So in terms of contribution, I feel that's probably one of my biggest contributing things that I've done for the profession, is that deaf culture work.
Yes.
But that's it. I think we've. Oh, there's loads of people I just wanted to say. Laura Boyes, in terms of her work on the STP. Alison Lashwood as a leader of the GCRB when we were going through so many change, and also her work on PGD. Maggie Kirk as well as a nurse leader. So she was the academic advisor on the GCRB when I was there, very pivotal in helping to shape the structure of the guidelines and the academic rigor of the GCRB. And Clara Gaff.
Yes.
So, I shared an office with Clara when we were both in Cardiff, and she was running the Cardiff Masters then. Just very, very influential in the way that the training of the Masters programme in Cardiff went after Heather left. So those are key names for me as well.
And there's thousands more. Not thousands more, a few hundred more. Thank you. That was fun.
Yeah, no, it's good fun.
We could talk for hours. But the world could write, couldn't we?
We do talk for hours.